Here it is, guys. This is my new go-to indoor 2.5-inch Cinewhoop, and in this video I'm going to show you step-by-step how to build it. I've been really testing this thing out for a couple weeks now, and I love how it flies. This drone can carry a full-sized GoPro, it's capable of 6S, clearly, and with this GNB 1100 6S LiPo, I'm getting 10-minute long flight times. So up until about a week ago, the Cinewhoop that I used for 99% of my real estate FPV projects was this custom-built 2.5-inch Cinewhoop on the GEP-RC Cinelog 25 frame. This drone has filmed tons of projects, has been nothing but reliable, and it's now going to be one of my backup 2.5-inch drones. This is my new rig, and it's got some awesome upgrades. But before we get into building this thing or going over any parts, if you're looking for a budget 2.5-inch Cinewhoop or a Cinewhoop that's going to whip around and do flips and freestyle, that's not what I'm showing you how to build. That's not how I fly my Cinewhoops, and I don't think that's how Cinewhoops really should be flown. This drone is meant for slow, cinematic 4K footage. I've been using this drone out on real estate projects for the last couple of weeks, and it's my new favorite drone. I honestly can't stop flying it. Let's go over the parts that I used and get into the build. Alright, so the frame you guys probably already know if you follow this series that I've been doing. This is the BetaFPV Pavo 25 frame, and this is going to make for a nice and easy build since it basically gets put together with just 6 screws, plus I'm going to be able to put a little LED on the back here, which is going to look sick. So yeah, for the frame, BetaFPV Pavo 25. Next is the flight controller ESC. So for this build, I'm using the iFlight Beast 55 amp all-in-one board. iFlight has been coming out with some solid flight controllers lately, and I expect this one to be just as good as all the other ones I've tested out. Obviously, I'm not going to be using all 55 amps from this ESC for this build, but it's good to have the extra power on a Cinewhoop this size. This board has the MPU 6000 gyro, but they also have boards that have been shipping with the BMI 270 gyro on it as well. For the video transmitter, I'm using a Caddx Polar Nano Vista kit. Next, let's take a look at the motors. I chose to go with some HGLRC Aeolus motors, and these are 1303.5 2500 kV. So these are capable of 6S. I have Aeolus motors on one of my other 2.5-inch drones, and I love them. I've noticed that the lower kV motors like this really perform awesome on 2.5-inch Cinewhoops. For props, I'm going with the trusty Gemfan 5-blade D63 props. These are my go-to prop for 2.5-inch Cinewhoops. And lastly, for the receiver, I'm going to be using this BetaFPV ELRS Nano receiver. This is the 915 MHz version, and I would recommend using something with good penetration like this because the signal is going to have to penetrate through multiple walls in a house. All right, let's get to building this thing. Take everything out of the boxes. I'm not going to go over how to assemble this frame at all. This is probably the most simple 2.5-inch frame that you could ever deal with. You have 6 screws up here, so just basically take those out and then it'll be separated in half. If you'd like to see how this frame goes together, I do have a whole separate video on that, so I'll leave a link to that down in the description. So with that separated, I'm going to put that aside, and we're just going to focus on this. So let's get our motors mounted up. The drone is going to be in a pusher configuration, so you're not going to have the motors like this. You're going to have them basically upside down, and make sure that the wire is running along this arm right here. So you're given 2 different size screws with the motors to mount them to the frame. Use the shorter ones for this. If you use the longer ones, you could have it go through the frame and actually into the motor windings, and that'll ruin the motor. All right, so we got the motors all mounted up. I'm going to just kind of put these wires behind so they're not getting in the way of anything. Now what we want to do is take the screws that came with your flight controller and put them through the board so that we can mount this up. So now with the motors all mounted up on here, let's take our flight controller and we'll get these little rubber grommets into these 4 holes on each corner. So now with those 4 grommets in, let's get our XT30 and a capacitor soldered up to the board. Something real quick I want to mention with a flight controller like this, you will see a little arrow. The arrow on this one is right here, and that's going to always be pointing to the front of the drone. Right here we have the battery pads, so we have positive and negative, and this is where we're going to be soldering the battery lead to. And also the side that you see the arrow on is going to be the top side. So when we're mounting this into the drone, since this frame is upside down, this is actually going to be mounted like that. So just keep that in mind when you're assembling this. So when we're soldering our XT30 connector to the board, you're also going to want to take into consideration that you should really solder on this capacitor that's included with the flight controller. And you can either solder this right to the board, or you could solder it like I have done here directly to the XT30 cable. I think 90% of my drones have the capacitor on the end of the XT60 or on the end of the XT30, and none of those drones have any issues. So I do this on as many drones as I can just because it keeps it a lot cleaner. And with a 2.5-inch Cinewhoop build, I'm not sure how much room I'm gonna have underneath or below this board. So if I can keep the capacitor off of the board and on the XT30, I'm gonna do it. So now let's solder up this XT30 to this board. Definitely get a flux pen if you don't have one. It just makes soldering a little bit easier. I'm gonna put some flux on the battery connectors where we're gonna be soldering to. So now I'm gonna put a little bit of solder on the power pads right here. So now I'll get my battery lead on here. I also put a little bit of solder on the end of these wires. So now it's going to be even easier to solder to this flight controller. I'm going to get these wires to be as flat as I can. Like I said, because I don't know how much space I'm going to have to work with above or below this board. Nice. So instead of putting solder on the ESC pads on the top of the board, I'm actually going to put it on the bottom of the board. Because when the flight controller is sitting in the drone, it's actually going to be sitting like this. So in order to solder the motors to this board, it's going to be sitting like this. So I'm going to put some solder on these and then we'll continue. The frame and the flight controller both come with these screws. I'm going to use these ones, but these are going to basically just get pushed through on the 25 by 25 mounting holes, and then I'm going to take these little clear hex screws or bolts, whatever, dude, you know what I'm talking about, and I'm just going to put it on here so that it holds these in place when I put the flight controller on. Before I put the flight controller on the frame, I'm actually going to solder the LED and the receiver to the board. The Caddx Vista that I'm using is going to plug right into this port right here. All right, so I'm going to solder the LED that comes with the Pavo 25 first, and then we'll do the receiver. We have an LED pin right here on the corner. Then right here we have ground, and then down here we have a 5-volt pad. So I'm going to put some flux on those, and then I'm going to pre-tin them and get it soldered up. All right, so this pad right here. And then we have this pad right here. It's kind of a longer pad. So you have two pretty long pads right here. One's 5-volt and one's ground. The top one is the ground. So then we have the LED pin right there. So these pads are pretty small, but we get the LED up top, got the ground there, and then we have 5-volt right down here. I almost forgot, I have a cable for the Naked Hero 8, so I'm just gonna connect that to these battery leads. So now I'm just gonna get my receiver all soldered up with some wires, and then we'll attach it to the flight controller. So this will depend on what receiver you're using. I'm using this ELRS one, so this uses the Crossfire protocol and uses the RX and TX, so we're gonna have to solder it to the RX and TX pads on the flight controller. But if you're using an S-bus receiver, you're gonna hook it up to just the S-bus pad or the RX pad on the flight controller. It's probably a little tough to see, but on this flight controller, up above the LED pad right here, there is an RX and a TX, and then we have the ground that we connected the LED ground to, and right underneath that is another 5-volt pad. So we're going to connect the receiver to those 4 pads. Now I'm just going to put a little bit of solder on these pads, and we'll get the receiver hooked up. All right, let's get this receiver hooked up. As you can see, The white one goes to RX, yellow goes to TX, and then red's voltage, and black is ground. So with these receivers, we're gonna need the RX to go to TX on the flight controller. So the white wire is gonna go to TX, and the yellow wire is gonna go to RX. So the RX pad on this flight controller that I'm gonna be using is, it's so tough to see. These pads, the pads on this flight controller are very, very small. So this one right here is the RX, and then this is the TX. Oops. Right like that. Then we'll do the white wire, and that's going right next to that. Perfect. Now we'll get the 5-volt and ground pads hooked up. So now I'm going to put the antenna on the receiver, and we'll put some heat shrink around it to just protect it. All right, let's get this thing secured to the drone, and we'll solder on these motors. So when you're mounting this on the drone, again, this is the top of the board, so we're going to want it to be like that. So kind of position all your cables how you want, and we'll secure this down. I'm going to have the LED going over the board, and I'm going to have this going over the board, and then I have the receiver wire going underneath the board. So that's going to go between the flight controller and the Caddx Vista. Perfect. Love it. So now the XT30 cable can go right underneath here through this cutout right here next to motor 1. So I'm going to show you how to do one motor, and then the rest of them will be the same. So this is motor 1 right here. What I'm going to do is run it along the arm up to the ESC, and then kind of give it a little bit of slack so I can trim it about right there. Now I'm just going to strip the wire shielding off and expose the wire. We're going to pre-tin that, and since we already pre-tinned the ESC, we'll be able to solder it right on. And when you're soldering these wires to the ESC, it doesn't really matter which way or which order, I guess, you solder the wires on. Usually I try and keep it just flat, but you can, twist them if you prefer how that looks. You do you, boo-boo. So put some solder on there, put some solder on there, put some solder on there. Get these tinned up. Now we'll position these wires, and I'll probably end up putting a zip tie down on this wire to just secure it a little more. Bend the wires how you want, and now just solder them right to the ESC. So like I said, it doesn't matter which order you put these in, because that's basically just going to change the direction of the motor. So this one I'm going to put here. This one I'm going to put in the middle. And this one's going to go on the end. Right like that. So now just do the same for all 4 motors. All right, so I got all the motors all soldered up. So now what we're gonna do is focus on the Caddx Vista, and that's the last thing we gotta get connected to this board. So with the iFlight board, it came with these 2 cables. Both cables are the same. I'm using this one. I just took out the S-bus and ground because I'm not using the Caddx receiver. So I'm gonna take my Vista, and I'm just going to get this soldered up to the Vista. So with the Caddx Vista, it's kind of the same as connecting a Crossfire style receiver. The gray wire is going to RX on the flight controller, so we're going to connect it to TX on the Vista, and then the white wire is going to TX on the flight controller, so we're going to connect that to RX on the Vista. Got that all soldered on there. Let's get the antenna on. All right, so I have the Vista all set. I got this cable on here, got the antenna all set, and this is pretty much ready to go. So before securing this down, what you're gonna wanna do is take this little CNC adapter that comes with the Pavo 25 frame, and this is gonna separate the Caddx Vista from the flight controller. So everything's gonna be sitting in a stack, and this is just gonna kind of space it away from the flight controller and allow a little bit more airflow. So the way that I'm gonna mount this is you have a flat side, and then you have a side that has ridges, like these kind of pop up a little bit more. The side that pops up a little bit more, I'm gonna have facing the flight controller. So I'm gonna have this mounted right like that, or right like that. So to mount this, what you wanna do is, with the Pavo 25 frame, it came with a whole bunch of screws, and these ones we're gonna put through, and it just threads right into the CNC adapter. And just do those one at a time. So we're gonna have the rear of the drone back here. So I'm gonna have the antenna facing there, the camera facing up front, and then the cable is gonna actually run underneath through this CNC adapter because the port is sitting right here. So I'm gonna lift this up a little bit to just get some access to that port. I'm gonna plug this in. Right like that. And now we can take the Caddx Vista and just kind of put it right on top of the flight controller, and you're gonna have these 25 by 25 holes on the CNC adapter line up with the ones that are going through the flight controller. So now you can take your screwdriver and just kind of thread these in real light so that it starts, and just go around to each one. And now you can tighten them down. There we go, we can secure our camera. So you can, this is literally just gonna fit right in here. So the camera just fits right in there. We can take some screws and put it in the side to secure that down. Get that started. Cool, so we got the camera secured down, we got the Caddx Vista, the flight controller, everything's all set. So now let's hop over to the computer and we'll do a little bit of tuning. All right, time to tune this drone. First thing you're gonna wanna do is go over to esc-configurator.com. I'll leave this link down in the description. And what you're gonna wanna do is just plug a battery into your drone. Make sure it's plugged into the computer, make sure it's selected. If it's not selected, you can hit open port selection, and then you should see it right here. And then just hit connect. It should detect it, and then hit read settings. Now, I already have Bluejay flashed to this ESC, so I'm not gonna flash Bluejay to it again, but I'll show you guys how to do it. Basically, just go down to flash all ESCs. Make sure you have Bluejay selected. Yours will probably say BLHeli-S, select Bluejay. Make sure that you have GH30 selected if you're using this board that I used on this build. If you're using the Blitz version of this board, make sure you select GH50 instead of GH30. So just be aware of whether you have the Blitz or the Beast version of this board, they're both pretty much identical. Version, select the latest version, V0.16. And then for PWM frequency, just use 48. Then hit flash. It'll do its thing. I'm not going to hit flash because I have the firmware that I like on there. And once you have Bluejay flash to the ESC, it'll bring you back to the screen and you're all set. So through this menu, you can change the beep strength. You can change the startup power. I wouldn't mess with any of these settings. The only one that I'd really recommend messing with is the beep strength. This is just kind of the volume of the startup beeps. I usually keep this around 40. And I feel like that's loud enough, but you could max it out. You can have it non-existent, whatever you want. I usually keep mine at 40. So once you're done in here, just click Write Settings. It'll save any changes that you made. And then once that's done, we can disconnect and we'll go over to BetaFlight. All right, so now that we have Bluejay all installed on the ESCs, we can use bidirectional D-Shot and we can get a better tune with RPM filtering. If you don't flash Bluejay to the all-in-one board, you're not gonna be able to do the tune that I have on this thing. So I'm gonna actually unplug the LiPo just because I don't want to overheat the Vista. So now plug the drone into the computer and we'll do some BetaFlight setup. All right, so you'll probably get a warning error like this. This is basically just saying that the accelerometer isn't calibrated. So we'll close this, and to calibrate the accelerometer, just place the drone on a nice flat level surface and hit calibrate accelerometer. Before you do this, make sure that you're running 4.3.1. If you aren't running at least 4.3, just go to the update firmware and just install 4.3.1. So we'll calibrate the accelerometer. Once that's all set, we will go to the ports tab. And then the ports tab is where you basically configure everything that's hooked up to the flight controller. So the Caddx Vista is on UART1, so we're going to turn on configuration MSP for UART1. And UART3 was the UART that I used for the receiver. So under serial RX, we're going to turn this little switch on right here. And if you have a GPS, I don't know who the hell's hooking GPS up to a 2.5-inch Cinewhoop, but if you have a GPS or Bluetooth module or whatever else you're hooking up to it, just configure it using the corresponding UART that you hooked it up to, and then we'll hit save reboot. Now we can head to the configuration tab. So under the configuration tab, there's really not much you have to do. I like turning on RX loss and RX set. That basically makes it so that the beeper function uses the ESC beep. Arming I changed to 45. And then make sure LED strip is turned on. We do have that little LED strip at the back of the drone, so to configure that, you'll need the LED settings. If that's off, you won't have the LED option in here, so turn that on. And air mode. Make sure that air mode is turned off. This is the kind of thing that you can turn on using a switch, and that's how I prefer to have my Cinewhoop set up, because I usually fly with air mode off, because I've noticed little fans or ACs or any type of wind with flying indoors does affect the drone, and when you have air mode on, it kind of fights it. So I've noticed the best results with air mode off. So this looks good. Let's save reboot. Now we can go under presets. I'm going to key in Cinewhoop, and we're going to use the UAV Tech Cinewhoop preset. This preset's been performing awesome on this little drone, and just be aware of the different options that are in here. You have a 48K, 96K, and by default, without either of those selected, it's 24K. So just make sure you select the right PWM frequency that you selected. If you remember, I selected 48, and you should have selected 48 too. RPM filtering, we'll turn that on, and it should look like that. We'll hit pick, agree, save and reboot, and now it's basically just going to apply those settings to the flight controller. Now we'll head to PID tuning, and we're not going to have to do anything actually in the PID profile settings or the filter settings, because the preset that we just applied changed all the settings in there, and it's gonna fly good. The only other thing we're going to change is the rate profile settings, and these are my rates that I use for indoor flying. I know a lot of you guys have been waiting for these, and here they are. So we're going to change the pitch and roll center sensitivity to 40, and then yaw center sensitivity to 50. And then for max rate, for roll and pitch, these are going to be 150, nice and low. And then yaw, I'm going to make 200. And expo, across the board, just keep that at 0. So these are really, really low rates. These are going to make it so you can fly nice and slow inside. Don't try and do any Matty flips or split S's or anything with this. Don't do any freestyle with these rates, because you'll crash your drone. These are very, very slow. They're perfect for indoor flying, and the type of flying that this drone is meant for, these rates will work perfect. I don't change any of these settings over here. This looks good. Once you have these numbers in, we can hit save. And then we'll head over to receiver. I guess we could set this up now. So depending on what receiver you have hooked up, will depend on what protocol you're using. S-Bus is selected by default, but we're using ELRS, so I'm going to select the Crossfire protocol. And we'll probably have to change this, but I'll show you guys that in a second. Save reboot. And basically the next couple settings, we're going to need a battery plugged in, but before we plug a battery in, I'm going to hop down to the LED strip tab, and this is basically just where we're going to set up the little LED that's on the back of our drone. So to do this, we're going to select wire ordering mode, and you can select any 2 LEDs in here. You can select 2 in the middle, 2 up top, 2 like that, whatever you want. I'm going to select these 2 right here, and then I'm going to change this to color,
and you can have a color modifier. The Larsen scanner does look cool if you're using like a longer LED strip, but since this LED strip is just 2 LEDs, it doesn't really look that cool, so I just kind of keep it as a solid color. And you can also have it blink. That looks cool, whatever you want. But you can have the LED be white, red, orange, yellow, green, 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 blue, 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 whatever you want. I like 8. I think this color blue looks pretty cool, so I'm going to just use that. And that looks good. So then we'll hit save. Now we can hop over to the receiver tab. And I'm going to go grab my controller. And we're just basically going to make sure that we're seeing stick input. So I'll turn my controller on. I know that this receiver is already bound up to this controller, but we have to make sure that we get switches set up and everything in here is looking good. So I'm going to plug a battery into the drone, and hopefully it connects. There it is. So it thinks the throttle's the roll, and these are kind of all messed up. So to fix this, you go to the channel map and just change this to, just kind of play with these options and you'll find one that works. So once you hit save, now throttle's throttle, and you know, everything's back to normal. Make sure the switches work and look good. This looks perfect. So with that saved, now we'll head to the modes tab. And this is basically where you set up all the switches on your controller for the drone to arm, for the beeper, all that kind of stuff. So I'm just gonna turn this off. We'll start with arm, add range, make sure that auto is selected, and take your controller and switch the switch that is going to control the arm function, and you'll see this little yellow dot kind of moving around. Basically, you're going to want this bracket right here to be around this little yellow dot, and that's going to signify the on position. So when it's like that, it's off, like that, it's on. So we're going to do that down the line for all the different modes you want to set up. I'll show you guys how I have my Cinewhoop set up. I like to have angle mode, even though I never use it. All of the indoor flights that I do, it's always an acro. I do like having angle set up just as like a backup option, even though I never use it. So we'll add that. We'll put that on aux 4 in the upmost position. We'll change that. Horizon I don't use. Head free, nah, beeper. Obviously want a beeper. Air mode. I like having air mode on a switch. Like I said, air mode is the kind of thing that I will use for like outdoor flying, but when you're flying indoors, you really want air mode off, just because it kind of fights the drone when you're flying indoors and you deal with a little bit of wind. It makes it more difficult to fly. Just trust me. Having air mode off, you'll fly a lot smoother indoors. But yeah, have it on a switch so that in case you are flying outdoors, you can turn it on. So that one switch is gonna, aux 4 is also the switch that I use for angle mode. So when it's in the middle position, it'll be in air mode, acro, and then when it's down here, it'll be an angle. And then up here is just acro without air mode on. And then the only other thing that I like to set up, just as a safety, is flip over after crash. I don't really ever use this on Cinewhoops just because I don't want to burn out the ESC on a drone that I'm using on a project. And if I crash, usually I'm 99% of the time I'm able to just go pick it up. So I don't really see the use in this unless it were to like land on a roof or someplace that I can't reach. Then I could see flip over after crash coming in handy just in those kind of emergency situations. And that looks good. So now I'll hit save. And we'll go hide unused modes, and that'll make it so you can see all the modes that you just set up. And just kind of flick the switches and make sure that everything is working good. Looks good. So now the last thing we got to do is just check the motor direction. So to do this, we have a little drone diagram right here with motors 1, 2, 3, and 4. Typically, motors 1 and 4 are going to spin clockwise. They're always going to spin the same direction, whether it's clockwise or counterclockwise. But usually they spin clockwise, and then motors 2 and 3 usually spin counterclockwise. To check the motor direction, all we're going to do is enable this. And before you do this, make sure you don't have any props on your drone at all. We're going to turn this on, and then I just like to go one by one and just kind of feel the motor, and you'll be able to tell what direction it's spinning. So you don't have to spin it much, just spin it that much, and then just kind of rub your finger up against the motor bell as it's spinning. And I can tell that this one is actually moving counterclockwise. So according to this diagram, it's supposed to be spinning clockwise, but it's spinning counterclockwise. So we can always change the motor direction down here. If motor 2, though, is spinning clockwise, since that's going to be the opposite direction of this, we might be able to just use this motor direction as a reverse switch. So motor 2 is spinning clockwise. So now I'm just going to check motor 3 and 4 and see which way they're spinning, but hopefully we'll be able to just flip this switch. All right, so motor 4 is spinning the same direction as motor 1, and motor 2 and 3 are spinning the same direction. So luckily I don't have to do any motor direction changes in this. All I have to do is change the motor direction to be reversed, and we're good. Make sure bidirectional D-shot's on. That should be on from the preset that we applied, but yeah, this looks good. So now the last thing you got to do is put some props on this. Maybe set up your OSD if you have OSD elements that you prefer to have on the screen. I'm not going to show you how to set up OSD. I think it's pretty, I feel like there's a lot of videos out there and it's just pretty easy to do. But yeah.
All right, so now that we have this all programmed in BetaFlight, let's get it secured to the ducts. So on the ducts, you have the rear and the front. The rear, you can tell it's the rear because it has this little cutout for the LEDs. Hopefully you guys can see that. There you go. That little cutout is for the LED, and then above that sits the antennas. So get the LED in first. You don't have a lot of slack to work with, but it does fit. The LED has this little TPU piece. This just clicks over it, and that kind of helps it stay in place. So it goes like that. And then you have this antenna piece that just sits right over the LED, and that kind of helps hold it in place. So now we have the receiver and a bunch of wires, and those are all just gonna fall into this channel that's right in front of, right through here. Just make sure you have the receiver in there and you don't have any wires poking out or getting pinched. And honestly, the rest of it should just fall right into place, right like that. You probably noticed that I am not using the original mount that BetaFPV included with the drone, and that was this one. This is a hard mount, so it just hard mounts to the frame. When I was originally tuning this drone, I was experiencing a lot of jello with this mount. I was able to tune it out, and if you use this mount, whether you use this mount or this mount, you're not gonna have any jello. But personally, I prefer to use the vibration dampening mount just because I feel like it makes the overall video a little bit smoother. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take the 6 screws. We have 2 holes up front, 2 holes in the middle, 2 holes in the back, and then it pretty much just comes down to putting props on. All right, so now let's put some props on this. So if you remember in BetaFlight, we had motors 1 and 4 spinning counterclockwise, and then motors 2 and 3 spinning clockwise. So I'm gonna take 2 clockwise props, those go there, these go here, and I'm gonna flip it over. And this one went here. Like that. This one went here. This one went here. And finally, this one for motor 4. Now we'll just use the little screws that were included with the motors, and we'll secure that down to the motor. All right, we got the props on here. This thing is looking awesome. Before we hop over to some flight footage, I did want to mention that I ended up swapping the FPV camera out for a Runcam Falcon Nano. The Polar Nano camera is good, but this Runcam Falcon is much better. This is the camera that came on the SpeedyBee Flex 25, and it's my favorite digital camera that I have, so I figured it would only be fitting to throw it on my new favorite Cinewhoop. I don't want to get into a whole camera comparison, but this camera has 1080p 120 FPS and is 4:3, whereas the Polar Nano is only 720p 60 FPS and 16:9. So with this camera, I'm going to be getting an overall bigger image. So I feel like the upgrade to this camera was kind of a no-brainer. I'll leave a link to the Runcam Falcon Nano kit down below. Now to some flight footage. In the interior drone tour that you're about to see, I used this exact setup with a naked Hero 8 right on top. For the battery, I used this GNB 1100 6S LiPo. So there you go. That's how to build and tune a cinematic, slow-flying, solid little 2.5-inch Cinewhoop. Again, this drone isn't built or tuned to do Matty flips and split S's. It's meant for slow, cinematic indoor flying. Flying Cinewhoops indoors has become my full-time job since starting New England Drone Tours, and I'm pumped to add this little beast to our lineup of drones. So usually for drone builds like this, I keep the parts list on the down low until the video is released. I do this so that my subscribers all have an equal chance to get the parts before they sell out, and that tends to be the case. I'm sure after I publish this video, a lot of these parts will go out of stock within a week. If you're just dying to know the parts list before the video is released, go check out my new Patreon page. All of my patrons will get access to the parts list for upcoming drone builds first, and then the rest of the world will get it with the videos released. I'll be doing this for every drone build on the channel going forward. Also, if you decide to become a patron, you'll get access to additional videos, behind the scenes content. We'll probably do some giveaways. You can direct message me for technical support, and I would like to run some polls to gauge what kind of videos you guys would like to see. I really want to treat my Patreon as a VIP kind of deal for my subscribers so that I can interact with you guys more. So go check it out. I'll leave a link to that down below and up in the corner right about here. All right, back to the drone specs. I've mainly been flying this drone with a naked GoPro 8 and this 1100 6S LiPo, and I've been pretty consistently getting 10-minute long flights with this, which is pretty damn good for a drone this size. I tested out a handful of batteries, and if you're interested in seeing those tests, I actually filmed it, and it's on my Patreon, so go check out my Patreon. But overall, I found myself using the 1100 6S more than anything. So like I mentioned in the beginning, this drone can lift a full-size GoPro, and I think it will work awesome with the new GoPro 11 Mini. I threw a Hero 9 on this just to test it, and it did work. I had the iFlight balance lead coming off the side and attached to the LiPo on the back. So I would definitely recommend doing that if you do plan on using a full-size GoPro. I'd also probably look at a smaller battery like this 850 6S. I think you should probably just use a naked GoPro or something like a Runcam thumb, but if you insist on using a full-size GoPro, at least use a smaller battery than this and use that iFlight cable, and you should be good. All right, so I know people are gonna wanna know the weight. This weighs 161 grams, and that's without an action camera. When you add an action camera like a naked GoPro 8, you're at 193 grams. If you add a Runcam Thumb Pro, you're at 178 grams, so you could probably find a 6S battery that could keep you under the 250 gram limit. Otherwise, the batteries that I'm using do push you over 250. This one's at 311, this is the 6S, and then the 5S pushes you to 298 grams, and that's with the Runcam Thumb. So I'm sure you could find batteries that keep this setup under 250 grams though. I just haven't tried them. I bet if you use a battery more in size with this 4S 750, you could keep this under 250 grams. So that's gonna do it, guys. Links to everything that I use in this video will be down in the description. If you want this dampened mount, I will leave a link to the STL in the description. And if you end up building this drone, definitely tag me in any video that you get from it. I love seeing flight footage from you guys using a drone that I helped you build. And yeah, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Consider joining my Patreon. If you have any questions about this beast of a Cinewhoop, leave a comment down below. Or if you're a patron, just shoot me a message.